Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CDH. I'm one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobsaurus, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Reed, aka Sick Robot.
Howdy.
And Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going?
And in this episode, we'll be covering how to navigate the stack. Basically what to do when you've got, a four-way Baral mirror.
Well, no, because Baral doesn't run removal, and removal actually sort of factors into this one. So.
Hey, there's bounce and steal.
Exactly, reshape. A single reshape.
Yeah.
Resculpt? Oh, did I even? Oh God, I forgot.
Yeah,
what the card was
resculpt.
called. Oh no. Actually, never mind. I'm running that one back. I'm pinning this blame on Baral because that card's unplayable, and you're making me remember it. Okay.
That card is. I play that card in way too many decks because when you don't have like A decay and trophy and stuff like that, you gotta do what you gotta do. Yeah.
Pretty bad.
Cool. But yeah, before we get into that, what have you guys been up to since the last episode? Because the last time we recorded all three of us together, turns out I think it was year in review, right?
And then if we're counting like actual podcasts, like it's probably, God, is it like creeping up on half a year or something?
Would have been more than that. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we were on a hiatus for a few months before that, and yeah, so it's been a while since we've done like a regular episode.
Yeah. I was gonna say yeah. So obviously we did year in review, and then basically I kind of like a last minute trip to Europe visiting my dad, and then we tried to get some stuff recorded before that. So then me and Morgan did an episode, but then it's been a minute. Yeah, I guess that's part of what I was doing, traveling, I guess. So and I've been getting back into after the hiatus. Really actually delving back into Magic a lot, CDH, doing lots of brewing, having lots of fun, playing games again. Sometimes you just need a break to find your love of the format again, and that's okay.
I've just been engaging with the community, and I think
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
God. I mean, we're not going to get into that one, but this one's for the people who are already in the know, I guess.
Yeah. Anything from you, Reed?
I said a few months ago at this point that I was getting back on the horse and getting back into the community, and then I promptly re-left the community and got addicted to Smash again. So, I mean, I've been playing a lot of Melee. The local community scene is thriving, so it's fun. But, yeah.
You've also been playing. You played a bit of Blue Farm. I only got to play against you on Blue Farm once.
I literally put together Blue Farm just to reorient myself with it. Okay, actually, this is actually a pretty good story. I feel like with a pretty decent resulting lesson, which was that I realized that I needed to brush up on Blue Farm play patterns a bit, mostly because everybody that we play with refuses to play Crom in any way, shape, or form, and not out of any disdain for it. I don't think, just because people just it's not the decks that interest anybody that we tend to play with, and it's a play group of 20 to 25 people in terms of extended play groups, and just nobody plays Crom. So I was just I need to reorient myself with this deck and just how it functions and stuff like that, so I don't have to either look for specific practice or just run into it in tournaments while being rusty. And then I realized that nobody plays it, so I was well, I guess I'll just play Blue Farm then, and I'll do it myself. And I sort of had this sense going into it, when you haven't seen a deck for a while, you're just I wonder if it's any different, or if the developments of play patterns over the past year or so have really meaningfully changed it or whatever. Because I've played Blue Farm before. I wasn't a huge fan of playing it at the time. I didn't think it was a huge amount of fun, but I was maybe Brian Cook's in immense changes to the playstyle and mulligan decisions of playing
Koval, yeah. Brian Cook does
Rogsai.
Yeah.
No, I know. I was talking about Brian Cook. I was talking about Brian Cook's always mulliganing for Ristic Study and Fish and mulligan decisions and stuff like that. I was thinking like, oh, like maybe this has sort of like changed how these decks actually end up playing. And then I played like 4 games of it. I was like, this is the exact same as it was like 2 years ago. This sucks. I hate this. So yeah.
So maybe that's a better strategy when Steel Enchantment is just a non-card in in other metas.
Honestly, it would be hilarious if Steel Enchantment becomes legit anti-turbo tech just because they're always mulliganing for a turn 1 Mystic Study. It's just like, either I'm dying before I could cast this, or it's just like the best possible card in all of these games.
Yeah, well, dude. I mean, worst case scenario, just pitches to misdirection, force of will, force of negation. Best case scenario, it's remove a Ristic Study and make your own. It's just for 2 mana, insane.
Actually, do you want to tell the story of the Steel Enchantment?
Oh yeah, yeah. The first game I played against Reed on Blue Farm, I think he drops a turn 1. Was it turn 1 Ristic?
It wasn't me. I wasn't even involved in it, but I was just there, like playing Blue Farm to witness.
Oh no, it was Zach. Yeah, it was Zach's Ristic Study.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and then our friend Tim, Steel Enchantments, the Ristic Study, and then I Steel Enchantment it again.
And then actually, so the funny part about it was we had to stop Legend and be like, okay, you're casting the Steel Enchantment. What are you targeting with it? Because there's a Steel Enchantment and there's a Ristic Study.
Yeah, so I ended up making, I think it was the right call in the end, which was to take the Ristic Study, because that way, if they remove my Steel Enchantment, or like Tim, I think because Tim was in Azorius, which means it's hard for him to kind of single target remove something. So then this incentive is to kind of remove the Ristic Study instead of just giving the Ristic Study back to someone else, I think was the reasoning.
And also, he couldn't Cycrypt back his own. Like, he couldn't have Cycrypted back his own Steel Enchantment. Because you don't... Like, he still controlled his own Steel Enchantment. You just overrode it with your own. And I think it actually ended up mattering later in the game, too. And we were just, like, incredibly surprised that it did.
So yeah, I mean, that was one... It's kind of rare when you run into situations, or I mean, one... Like, I don't think I've ever run into that double Steel Enchantmenting something, or it's been a long time since I have. Man, it's sometimes you have to shake off the rust in those kind of situations. You're like, oh god, I have to actually think about how to target things again.
You also just play like the worst possible collection of decks for like shaking off rust.
Yes,
because none of them are good, and none of them can end the game quickly. So they and that stacked on top of the actual strategies that you play just end up having like
all my decisions matter, and it adds up across the course of the game. You have to
be super familiar with everything that you're playing with to make like the good decisions.
Yeah,
it's just like so bad.
And it forces. I mean, part of the idea is that it hopefully forces me to just get better. Sometimes that's true. I mean, that's why I need to go back to Baral. I need to play more games with Baral. I got a lot better last time I played Baral for an extended stint.
Nobody has ever said that sentence ever. I need to go back to Baral.
It's the control equivalent of hitting the gym. It's such a bad deck that you have to just maximize every decision. You have to maximize you have to maximize everything just to eke out wins. So it's pretty good.
It's doing like active, just like resistance training it's like incredibly close to just like hurting yourself.
Oh, I think of it when I play Baral as like when Rock Lee fights Gara and he drops.
I knew it.
Dude, I say this all the time. Yeah, when playing Baral is like with the freaking insanely heavy weights, and then once you like stop playing Baral and you played it for like the past several months, you gotten tons of games in, you just like you're free from your shackles and you're so much better.
Except like the decks that you play, you're like not actually dropping all the weights. You're dropping like
no. And
then you're just like you just refuse to acknowledge that you're still wearing leg weights.
Well, the thing is, if I was to drop all the weights, I'd be so uncoordinated that I would just probably hit myself in confusion. Yeah.
Just knock yourself out, jump into the ceiling.
Yeah, if I play a deck that's too good, I won't know what to do. But yeah, that's kind of what we've been doing. So yeah, without further ado, let's jump into housekeeping. And as always in housekeeping, we'd like to give a shout out to our new patrons. New patron this week is Alphonse D. So yeah, big thank you to Alphonse D for being a Patreon or being a patron and supporting the podcast. Thank you so much.
Oh my god, he's actually fixing it.
I fixed it years ago, or like
no, you didn't.
It's not like we have recordings or anything, but whatever. Okay, so yeah, that's housekeeping. New developments. Morgan, Reed, you guys can share this one.
Yeah, we're going to. Is it called MagicCon? Whatever. The thing in Minneapolis,
dude. I don't know.
On May 6th ish.
Yeah,
that's as good as I got.
5th to 8th, something like that. 5th to 7th.
Yeah, 5th to 8th, or 5th to 7th. Yeah, there we go. We're gonna be in Minneapolis. There's gonna be a bunch of other people who play CDH there, and most of them are cool people. And some have described us as cool people. So,
well,
if it's within your means,
despite your guys' best efforts to prove otherwise, it's still. They still give you that. So.
Yeah. To be clear, I was not saying I agreed with that characterization.
Yeah.
It has
many
been
people.
made.
Many people say that me and Morgan are good people.
Dude, unverified sources. It's yeah. Yeah. So that sounds like it sounds like it'll be fun. Bummed can't make it because I'm I've got like this. I don't have a massive travel budget this year, and I've got like this flight voucher that I'm saving. So hopefully, because I want to save it for like a larger meetup with some of the people on the Frog server. Hopefully, if there's like a big event. So
I think, unfortunately, I think Minneapolis is actually going to be like one of the bigger ones this year, but not for the Frog server, which sort of sucks.
Yeah.
We'll see if we can figure out.
We've been trying to. There's the whole. I mean, we don't have to get into it, but like there was the whole that old GP Toronto thing that was like pre-COVID. There's been
rip GP Toronto. That was going to be like the most stacked.
I know.
GP for CDH of all time.
Actually, tragic, but yeah, we've been trying to get something together for like let's all go to this one, and it just doesn't work out. So hopefully something this year, but we'll see. Yeah. Without further ado, let's jump into the actual topic, which is navigating the stack. So yeah, why bother talking about the stack, guys? Who cares? It's about just playing permanence. Not play a grand abolisher and never interact on the stack ever. Just play everything at sorcery speed.
Correct.
Yeah.
Is there? Yeah, just everybody has a defense grid in play.
Yeah,
I mean,
just play City of Solitude. Let's go.
Well, the end goal of CDH is to get it to a point where everybody just plays as if there's a defense grid in play already, so you can just cut all your defense grids and grand abolishers.
Yeah. Just the perfect metagame.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
exactly.
I was not aware that was the end goal, but I'm excited for.
Well, now you are aware, and that might color your understanding of meta developments over the past couple of years.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yep,
yeah, and in all seriousness, I think there's a we were having a super long discussion pre-show about like competitiveness and player agency and all these things back and forth, and one of the things where you have the most player agency in a game tends to actually be, I think, on the stack, where like very subtle. It's not just the difference, but the binary difference between casting a spell and not. I mean, obviously there is that, but there is so much more that you can kind of get out of it. And it's a large portion of the game, and a lot of almost every key CDH game or key moment in a CDH game is decided by some exchange on the stack, like realistically. It sometimes happens that someone can slam an abolisher and then kind of blank everyone else's interaction, but
I mean, there's usually a fight over the abolisher.
If people can, there's a fight over the abolisher, or what the abolisher is doing is basically removing the agency that other people would have had because they had all this interaction sandbagged, and most decks of CDH that have blue in them, they're like massive amount of instance, right, compared to other card types.
Yep.
So yeah, turns out that the stack is actually an area where you can kind of really eke out a lot of advantage. And so we're going to hopefully kind of go into how to understand that and leverage it and come out come out the other side as
Come out
best as
ahead,
possible. Yeah,
Dude,
as
I
far
think
as possible.
this is definitely. I think this is probably in the second largest category of Into the North episodes, where like the first category is just the list episodes, and I think this one's going to be part of the second largest category, which is the tips and tricks episodes, where I think we're just going to get into a lot of just like small interaction sequencing things that end up all stacking together to really making like a pretty big difference in how you actually play the game.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not. We've got a bit of a structure to this, but it's a bit loose. So it's kind of going to be maybe a bit just like abstract, kind of scattershot approach, where we're just going to bombard you with some kind of ideas and discussions and topics about the stack, and hopefully you take away something that's good from that.
Solution is left to the listener.
Yeah. So the kind of first aspect of just like understanding the stack. We're going to assume that you have operational knowledge of the basic kind of rules of Magic, but we wanted to kind of reinforce, without giving like a full detailed primer on how these things work, of just certain concepts that you should be aware of and look more into if you're not familiar with. Because knowing how these work and just the actual rules of the game allows you to, eke out small percentage points, or, actually just understand how people are interacting and how the game is unfolding. So some things we have here are AppNap, so active player, non-active player. So that's to do with who has priority in response to and how triggers stack.
Well, it's how you put triggers onto the stack that like trigger off of the same thing happening. So it's like actually can be like pretty relevant a lot of the time, and I think a lot of people get lazy about AppNap, especially during like you'll put a bunch of triggers on a stack, or like cast a bunch of spells in sequence with like some Ristic Sites or whatever on the board, and then somebody will stop and be like, okay, whoa, I need to like do something at like this very specific point in time, or like at this very specific timing, and by the time that you've gotten to that point, it's like, oh, we didn't actually like go through and figure out how the triggers were being put on the stack, and that's probably going to matter now.
Yeah, the fact that you might be drawing a card off of Ristic Study before someone else, before someone else's Ristic Study or Remora, that matters. That matters a lot. That seeing one extra card sooner, you draw a counter spell before they do, like that can matter a lot. So
just as a reminder for like active player, non-active player, what that does mean is that like, so say your turn player with a Ristic Study in play, and the person to your right, so the person who's currently like last in turn order, also has a Ristic Study in play. If somebody else at the table casts a spell, your trigger is going to go on the stack before the person, like the last person's trigger, will go on the stack, which means that theirs is going to resolve first in that scenario. So you have to be aware of like what order stuff goes in the stack in there. Anyway.
We also have kind of how priority works and mana bullying. Morgan, you can talk about that if you want.
Yeah. So there's a couple. I mean, again, we're assuming you understand how things work generally in Magic. A couple things that sort of behave a little differently in multiplayer are, first of all, it's the top element of the stack resolves when all players pass without taking any actions. Actions are very broadly defined in Magic, including tapping lands is technically an action. So you can wind up with some odd sequences where, like, player A casts a spell, they're the active player, and then, let's say player C, like, taps a land, then theoretically the last person to pass is going to be player B, because player C will pass, then D, then back to A, and then B again. And so that can be used to sort of give people second chances to interact. And the other part where this comes up is when people are playing on other people's turns and there are triggers or multiple things on the stack, priority will return to the active player when anything resolves, which means, let's say it's player A's turn, player C tries to cast a removal spell, whatever. Normally, priority would pass, D passes, A passes, B passes, and then it resolves. But if there is something like a Ristic Study, the Ristic Study, you'll do the same thing. D passes, A passes, B passes, it resolves. And now A has priority, so it'll actually be D who's the last person to pass on it. So those are sort of like the two, I would say those are the two like most common edge casey scenarios that you'll see in CEDH games.
That second one is like still super important to like actually remember though, because it happens a lot more often than like you probably realize, and it like can make a large amount of difference, especially for stuff that we're going to talk about later.
So yeah, if you want to, learn more, I mean, I said we weren't going to do many primers, and we kind of did. So hopefully you guys found that helpful. But yeah, if you want to learn more, definitely suggest, becoming intimately familiar with all the rules of priority and, how triggers are stacked and whatnot. So yes, kind of next up, and we kind of add this late, but really I think it is the kind of key thing going into any sort of stack battle or whatever, and that's just knowing what you're trying to achieve. Like, what are your goals going into any stack fight? So, and that could even go, maybe, I'm talking about a stack fight in terms of like someone else casts a spell and maybe there's a counter spell already and they fight back. It's like, well, do I jump in now? Like, it could be like that, or it could even just be, I'm going to cast a spell. How much am I willing to commit to protect this? With the current resources I have in hand, sort of thing. Just knowing what your plan is beforehand, kind of using that assessment, really helps, especially because something that we is a point that we have a bit later on, which is like the sunk cost fallacy, right? And cutting your losses early. It can be hard once you've like started to play a spell. You some kind of value engine. You're like, okay, I'll defend this with the first thing. And then someone throws something else at it, and you're like, man, I've got like a couple more counter spells, and do I just keep going? Am I too far in at this point? When you kind of assess beforehand what you really want, how many counter spells you're actually going to devote to protecting it, that can help you avoid kind of falling into those pitfalls. So yeah, have a clear kind of set of defined goals of what you're trying to achieve. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, only just say that's like also just the case that like a lot of playing.
Yeah.
I mean, CH/games in general is just like, try to have a game plan before actually executing on like game actions.
Yeah, don't take the first legal game action you can. That's that. There's you gotta have a bit more nuance to it than that.
Usually not the best thing to be doing.
But yeah, so given assuming you're going in with a goal, depending on what the goal is, these different tips and tricks can be applied differently. So our next kind of point is, and this is kind of like the last big picture point, is breaking down the elements of the stack and how you're interacting with the stack or the things that would factor into your decision making into two key categories. That would be timing and sequencing. And I'll let you guys kind of talk about those more if you want.
Sure. So I guess we'll start with timing, which is essentially, trying to leverage the fact that it is a multiplayer format and other people are going to be taking actions, and some of those actions are, more or less predictable, and through a bunch of different tricks that we'll get into sort of in more detail. You want to be sort of maximizing, once you've picked the goal that we outlined in the last step, you can sort of try and maximize that goal, whether it's you want to be drawing interaction out of your opponents, or you're worried about something like if this turns into a big stack fight, that Rhystic Study is going to draw 500 cards and then we lose. So this, you really want to be deciding, am I just trying to shut this down early? Am I trying to get other people to spend as many resources as possible? All of these factors influence when you want to be playing your cards.
Yeah, another aspect of that too could be timing. I mean, you're talking about a Rhystic Study, but if there's a Remora, right, it could be you're trying to time going for a big spell, that like a big value engine push for a win, until someone is like timed out of their Remora, right? That can be something that you're you're waiting for, or wait until someone else decides that they want to remove the Rhystic Study or Remora because they're scared of the value it's going to generate as well. So just picking your moment for your own kind of proactive stuff as well.
Yeah. Or even just waiting, like even on a shorter time scale, like potentially waiting for like the fish player to get tapped out by somebody else trying to interact, or like trying to like police somebody else, and then like going for it once they don't have the resources to stop you with most of the draws. And then sort of moving on to sequencing. Sequencing here, really what we're talking about is if you have, say you have like multiple avenues to either interact or just like do something on a stack in a specific situation, really like heavily considering which one of those things that you're going to do first in that situation and what the benefits are. So this is like a lot of the time you also come up with like, if I have a Dispel and a Flusterstorm in my hand, and there's like an Adnaz being put on the stack, which one of those do I use first? Do I want to Flusterstorm and like hard counter it potentially without my opponent having any ability to interact? Do I want to like fire off a Dispel and potentially bait more interaction out of somebody before like saving the Flusterstorm for something else? Just paying attention to like, even if it seems like the difference between two pieces of interaction or just like two game plans in general. Say you're like, you have an option to like either fire off a removal spell or like Tainted Pact for a counter spell or something like that. Just like actually like going through and considering what the benefits are in not just this situation, but also like the benefits and drawbacks of like going forward. Like maybe I wouldn't normally cast the Flusterstorm in now, but I'm playing in a mod where I know there's going to be like a rule of law coming down relatively soon, so I want to like get in while the getting's good, and then like have the hard counter spell for later.
Or like it's like you're playing against a Cradle deck or something, like some deck that can go big in mana and you're going to expect to pay for it, and lots of things. I guess technically a lot of those are called like soft counters, right? Using your soft counters.
But even if we're talking about like how broad a counter it is, like if I'm like thinking about Swan Song versus Dispel, like I might want to save the Swan Song for much later if I think that there might be like an enchantment or something coming down the pipe that I might need a counter that this Dispel isn't going to be able to cover.
Absolutely.
Or same thing. It gets a lot more dynamic than that too. That these are simplistic cases, but even like a step up from that is like, okay, like do I want to burn a Force of Negation now to be able to hold up mana, or do I want to like use my mana and my card immediately and then like maybe lock myself out of this Force of Negation until later because that might have been the only blue card in my hand.
Yeah, it can also be just not even deciding what kind of counterspell. Could be counterspell versus removal, right? Like, do I need to counter this Seedborn Muse, right now, or can I remove it, or like, can I remove it next turn? How long can I let this sit? That stuff can factor in as well, because creature counters are very, very valuable, especially for things like Grand Abolisher, Ranger Captain. Okay, so that's kind of like, these are the broad categories. Timing and sequencing, and everything that we're going to talk about from now on in can kind of be placed into either one category or the other, or is like a mix of both. And these ones we're kind of just going to loosely bounce between as the discussion flows on. So, let's just talk about, in no particular order, table position.
Yeah, just get going. I mean, I feel like table position is like one of the ones that, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like one of the ones that is not initially obvious when you start playing or like start getting in, but is like an immediate light switch moment for a lot of people. Like once they realize like how much of an impact it has on like situations, like depending on who is actually turn player and who has last priority, like not even like shuffling people, but even like who is last in priority at this exact moment in this turn cycle, or on this specific turn, can matter like huge amounts.
Yeah, I mean, not even just priority as well, but available mana. Often, I play against when I was playing Brawl a lot, playing against Keegan, he'd be like, "Man, I hate sitting right next to you, like directly after you. Like it's so irritating to be your last in priority, and also you just like untapped all of your mana and resources. So yeah, like table position influences a lot in your decision making process for sure.
And it's not even like even using that specific scenario as well as an example. Like a lot of the time, like you'll hear people say like, yeah, like I hate sitting directly next to the control deck because like if I try to do like anything important, there's no chance for me to have like baited them or like for them to have tapped down in mana before I got to do my thing. But there's also like a ton of dynamicism to that as well. Like on other sides where it's like, okay, like I hate sitting like right before the control player untaps because they're incentivized to cash in their interaction right before they untap, and like they're incentivized to like just if I do anything moderately threatening that I might have been able to slip through otherwise because they need to hold up mana for later, like now they can just be like, okay, I'm just gonna like snap off a counter on that like fairy artisan or like fairy banished mind or something.
It boils
like
down to people not liking to play against control
untap.
players mostly, you know.
I wonder. Yeah. Maybe you could tell us, Logan.
Oh, that is. It's so much fun. But yeah, like so with table position, you know, we're talking about, you know, all the ways it matters. What are the tips and tricks that people need to know? So I'd say the first is that if you're first in priority after turn player, pass priority. Like that should be your first instinct should be to pass priority.
If the downside, typically if the downside of like a spell in the stack resolving is that basically everybody except for the resolving player is going to be impacted negatively, like a relatively similar amount, or like, you know, like just people lose the game because the spell is going to resolve. That means that everybody sort of has incentive to like not let it happen, which means that if you're not the last person in priority, and the last person in priority like probably has a way to deal with said threat, you don't really need to use your stuff. You could just sort of be like, all right, well, I mean, you're the last person to have any say on this, so if you don't want to die or if you don't want to be put in like a massively losing position, you're probably gonna have to go use your thing now.
Yeah, and then you kind of get into, if they don't have something, that's when you can get into kind of resetting priority. So like if someone's like a Thrasios player, if is the person who has last priority, that's often when you can just kind of pass things around, and they're kind of forced to activate Thrasios and tap out to either. So this is especially good when you're the turn player, the after turn player, right? So you know you're tapping out someone else because they're activating Thrasios to dig deep, looking for a piece of interaction. If they don't find it, you get priority back, and you can interact if you really want to.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that feeds into this one as well. Yeah, like even if you're most play groups aren't going to want to get involved in like 116.4 stuff, which is the mana like priority resetting, mana ability priority resetting, but this happens like more naturally a lot of the time. Again, like
cracking fetches,
cracking fetches, casting a cantrip out of your hand. Just like using whatever like random priority resetting thing that you have, just to like give the person another shot. To be like, well, I passed on the assumption that you had something, but since you don't, I guess I'll have to burn this now.
Yeah.
Which also that also you can get into like really interesting political situations with that one too, where it's like, yeah, I'm the last person in turn order, and I actually do have the counter spell, but instead I'm going to tap out to draw cards with Thrasios and the rest of the table deal with it.
With and kind of with table position and you know passing party and these things, I think it kind of dovetails nicely with the aspect of cooperation and communication, because if this really is dependent on who has stakes in the spell resolving. If everyone is against it, right? If it's just turn player who wants the spell to resolve, and then everyone is against it because either it's a win attempt or it's an insane value engine, or maybe even if it isn't just the turn player, like you know, it's like a curse totem, and then it's you and someone else in the pot who are like really affected by this particular stacks piece. Talk and communicate, and you can cooperate with your fellow players for the brief moment while this spell is on the stack. You guys are on a team. It's like it can be arch enemy, right? Which is one of the things that I think many people love about CDH is that constant dynamic shifting between allegiances, and you know everyone's out for themselves, but for you know briefly you guys can be allies. So announcing intentions sharing information on certain things. And like, I think one of the very useful things is clarifying interaction points. So one of the I think a key role is that if you're after turn player, you basically get to you hold priority, and it's not given until you pass it, right? It's not given to someone else until you pass it. So you can use this as a you briefly get on your soapbox and you can say, oh shit, this is we're gonna lose here, and this is exactly how we're gonna lose, and this is the only point we can interact. I don't have it. Okay, pass priority.
Also known as the hold priority lecture, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna hold priority, and you're gonna sit here and listen to me explain exactly what's about to happen and what's gonna go down.
And the thing is we've seen it in major tournaments where because there is a lack of communication, like there's people, just not everyone understands how every deck works. There's a lot of decks in CDH, there's a lot of random niche combos, and it can be very easy to take for granted that what you understand about other people's decks, everyone understands. And that's just not true. One thing you need to be also cautious of is not tipping off you need to assess the kind of competence of the actual turn player. Are they, like, make sure you're not giving them some kind of avenue to play around your proposed interaction.
That feels great as the turn player when you can milk the rest of the table for the information and just be like, oh, okay, somebody has a silence here. Let's see if I can work my sequencing to work around the silence at the table. But that is, it feels great when you're in a position to like receive that information and work around it. You should try to almost never like give away that information, like freely, especially. Sometimes you do have to like sort of give it away a bit just to let the rest of the table know what's up, but yeah, you shouldn't be just like blatantly telling the table like, oh, I can't deal with that.
But you can say things like, if we're going to interact, this is when we have to do it, and this is the kind of interaction that will work here. Or like you can't let this resolve. As soon as it resolves, even if you have a removal spell, that's not good enough. If you have a removal spell, you can actually use it here, but you need to point it at this, right? You need to point it at the Magda instead of letting the Clock of Omens resolve or something like that. So announcing intentions, when to work together, pretty much covered. Sharing information. Yeah, this is okay. Sharing information, I think, is one where it can get dicey, because sometimes it's like, and I've gotten into games, I'm sure you guys have as well, where you're playing with someone and everyone's trying to be a bit cagey about what they have exactly, the exact type of interaction they have, and then you're like, God, we're kind of going back and forth about this. Let's just drop. What do you have? Like, what do you have? I can tell you if this is the proper way to interact. Or if you don't know when to interact, I don't think you need to be super cagey about it, right? Like, just be like, I got this. Please just help me use this spell on how to stop it. Like, and because sometimes if you coordinate,
on how lost you are, but if it's like a relatively complex situation where like there like a lot of contextual stuff is going to matter, there's a certain point at which you can just be like, okay, this is the piece of interaction I have. When do I use it?
Yeah, and sometimes it can be and there's ones like more simple forms of communication where it's be like, I can't actually counter this, but I can back you up or something like that, right? Like those are kind of more clear. But certain times, if it's like you need to kind of get enough storm for a fluster, or you have a creature counter and someone doesn't, like, you need to kind of coordinate to ensure that you're sequencing things in the most effective way to stop your opponent. Then you can kind of be more liberal with your information sharing. But don't. I think you just need to not have like a hard fast rule against information sharing, and know when it's appropriate to share.
Yes. Yeah. That being said, though, I will say we actually had an example of this in a game that I think we were all in a week ago, a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, where I would be aware that like you should be willing to share the information when it's necessary, and like when you need to like not die, but also you should be aware of the questions that you're asking to extract some of that information, or like try to extract that information from the rest of the table as well, and what that gives up about your position. The one that I'm thinking about here is that there was
but wasn't your read wrong? Didn't he not have that interaction that you thought he had?
He still had the interaction,
But it was a different piece of interaction.
The point is, sure, but it was a piece of interaction.
Sure.
Which basically the point being that like, we were playing in a game where somebody wanted to like basically clarify game state just to get a general idea of what I think I was trying to resolve some game winning spell. And they just wanted to get a general idea of what I was working with. And one of the questions they asked, and it was a very specific question, which was, how much mana do you have right now? Which in response to a game-winning spell seems innocuous enough, but in a lot of situations could be a tip-off point of, oh, you have interaction. Because you wouldn't be asking me exactly how much mana I had unless, like, you were looking for, like, axes to interact here. But just, anyway, that's an example, but I would just say, like, try to be aware of what you're giving up by asking for specific by asking for specific information in specific ways, and if you can like just rework the way that you're like trying to acquire that information to not give up.
But sometimes it can actually be used to your advantage to falsely telegraph signals to your opponents.
Yes. Anytime we're talking about like specifically information sharing and stuff, you have to always be aware that like the Yomi levels go deep.
Yes, yeah. just don't be doing things unintentionally, right? The whole thing is you should only be revealing information when you want to reveal information. And you know, sometimes that can be, you know, you're revealing information even if it's not a bluff to send some kind of signal. It's just to kind of build confidence so that when you do have to sell the bluff, then you know it is going to stick. But you know, just be very deliberate with how you're what you're giving away, how you phrase things, on what questions you asked, etc. Okay, Morgan. Me and Reed were talking a lot for this last one. You pick a point from pull a point out of the hat and take it away.
We've actually just
all right. I think
Morgan into the Matt role now.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that people often mess up is in terms of sequencing, playing your cards in the right order for your goal. So we alluded to this earlier. One of the big, you know, the most obvious card I think with this is Flusterstorm, where Flusterstorm, I mean, in a world with both Veil and Mindbreak Trap seeing heavy play, it's not as sure a thing as it once was, but most of the time, Flusterstorm says no, right? Like,
yeah,
it's just hard to beat with interaction.
Just traditional, yeah. So,
you know, if you are looking at your hand and you see, like, I have Dispel, Swan Song, and Flusterstorm, and I have mana for all three of these, it's, you know, the order you play them in really is dependent on what you're trying to do, right? Because if you're trying to, say, draw out a lot of interaction, you want people to keep going, you might start with something softer, like you start with the Swan Song that, you know, you're expecting to eat, like a Misstep or a Pyroblast or whatever, and then maybe you think, okay, I'll try that, and then, you know, maybe somebody else will back me up on the Pyroblast, like they'll counter the Pyroblast or they'll swat it or something, and I get to hold my Flusterstorm, and, you know, that's great, you got to draw out another piece of interaction, hooray. Sometimes, though, if you're like worried about, say, somebody's wrist instead of your fish being fed, you might just go like, I want to shut this down right now, so I'm just going to lead with my Flusterstorm. There's also similar things that can happen with stuff like Silence and Veil of Summer, like using them.
Yep.
Offense. The old offense-defense question. Using them on your opponent's turn when you're not intending to win. Let's say.
Disruptively.
Sure.
Yeah.
But like, is
not
Veil of Summer ever disruptive? Anyways, using them with when you are intending to be disruptive, is also like, you know, there can be times when like leading on them is excellent if you just again want to shut things down, or holding them first of all because obviously they're very strong on your turn when you're going for wins, but also holding them to try and get people to commit. And I think another huge, actually, maybe this goes better in another category, but one thing that I just want to say before I forget is if you are planning on, like, let's say someone casts an ad nauseum and they've cast a bunch of rituals and stuff, and they have like a couple mana but not nearly enough to pay for your Flusterstorm. If you're just gonna Flusterstorm it, you should respond to Rhystic Study triggers to give people the option to pay when they realize they don't, like, if their planned turn isn't gonna happen, then they can spend their mana to pay for Rhystic Study triggers. And that's a thing that I think people often, they just get in the habit of like, oh, when there's an Adnos on the stack, I'm gonna let like the Rhystic Study triggers resolve to try and find more interaction. But if you're confident, it can actually be better to try and deny draw, or to give your opponents the opportunity to deny each other draws by shutting them down earlier.
Yeah, I'm honestly, I know that's an area that I can improve on a lot. That's one where I definitely don't consider that enough. But yeah, it's super relevant.
And the other thing with that is also to remind, like, if you make that play so that like people can do certain things to shut down like Rhystic Study draws or whatever, you should remind them of the fact that that's what you're doing.
Yes. Communication again.
It's very easy to sort of like outthink yourself and just be like, I'm gonna make this genius play so that I can like scrounge percentage points, and the rest of the table is just like, yeah, all right, whatever, draw. I'll just
It's definitely being clear about your intentions is a powerful tool.
Who would have guessed?
Okay, Reed, do you want to pick the next one?
Yeah, sure. So I think a big one in general here is that I think is probably like needs to be worked on even more. And I'm not good at this. I'm not sure that anybody on this podcast is like, well, I would say like is like objectively good at this either. Is sort of like recognizing when you need to stop fighting even when you have resources left to spend.
I'm not terrible at this, but I definitely could be better.
I wouldn't say any of us are like terrible at this, but I think like we all probably, and I'm not sure that I've ever actually like seen somebody who I would like mentally note as like, oh wow, you're like really good at evaluating this stuff. Because I think it's just like, first of all, it's like hard to have it come up enough. It comes up like
so hard to evaluate because you just don't know in the moment what they have in hand.
Yeah, that too. But so this is sort of talking about like if somebody, typically it's harder. It's also harder to explain in general because it requires certain game states, and it also like you have to explain it with the context of it's you and another person fighting, but the reason why you would stop fighting typically isn't the person that you're fighting with. It's the game state and the potential game actions of the rest of the table after this fight happens.
Things fall out of balance, yeah.
Yeah. So typically the situations that you'll see this happen in is you don't want like a big value engine that isn't immediately going to end the game, but is like coming down, and you would prefer to not be in play. You don't want it to resolve, so somebody casts a Rhystic Study. And you have a bunch to fight over this with. I have this Force of Negation, a Swan Song, a Dispel. Like I have all this stuff banked up ready to go, and enough mana to cast most of it. But if you fire off your Swan Song at the Rhystic Study, your opponent comes back with a Dispel, and you're like, yeah, I mean, I'll fire off this Force of Negation to try to get this Rhystic Study like gone, and then that opponent fires back again with another counterspell. Suddenly you're in a position where I'm looking at this Rhystic Study. This person's now spending the interaction on me, so they're tapping pretty low, and are not guaranteed to continue having interaction after this point. If I like fire off this last piece of interaction to like try to get the Rhystic Study to not resolve, and then they either fight back and have it resolve, or just let it get countered and then pass the turn without doing something impactful, the rest of the table has like a real opening now. We went from like 5 to 6 pieces of counter magic in people's hands down to like none, and nobody won the game. There's just a Rhystic Study in play now, but we're passing to other people's turns who like potentially have some really dangerous stuff going on. So sort of like evaluating in the moment, even if you went into that at the start, being like, yeah, I'll spend like all this interaction to counter this Rhystic Study. Like having the awareness in the moment to be like, I'm not sure that I should spend this like last piece of counter magic. Or like this last piece of interaction, because I think I might need this one, and I'm not sure that it's worth like not having this thing in play.
So yeah, I want to add on to that as well, because this kind of evaluation on, you know, not falling for the sunk cost fallacy, when to let go. This also applies to the player who's playing something like Rhystic Study.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you might need to just let your Rhystic Study get countered. Or, one thing that's, you know, because both players are like, they don't want to be the one who has to be responsible, right?
Yeah.
The player who's casting the Rhystic Study wants to be the one who ends resolving the Rhystic Study, and the other player is being the one who's being responsible, holding up the counter magic for the next player. And then, you know, obviously it wants to swap depending on who you are. What this can introduce is actually a great opportunity for politicking and making deals. So it could be something like, and I've done this before with Seedborn Muses, where it's like, okay, I'm going to resolve the Seedborn Muse. I'm going to use it to untap on my turn so I can, you know, have Thrasios activations up to stop so-and-so. But I understand that, you know, Seedborn Muse is a very, very scary threat. So what I've done before is I said, look, let me stick with the Seedborn Muse, and I will only activate it for the next, you know, 2 turn cycles or this turn cycle when you tell me I can activate it, right? Something as simple as that, where you're like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, I'm happy because I stuck a Seedborn Muse and I'm untapping. They're happy because, I mean, they get more time to pretend. Like, it's like you're delaying the kind of, so you're kicking the can down the road on the Seedborn Muse. Yeah. We're like, we're gonna make sure that no one else is gonna sneak in here and get a win, and then I can, you know, potentially try and reassess and remove the Seedborn Muse later. It's a discussion we can come back to. Circle around on that one.
God, if we just start using fucking corporate speak,
yeah.
I'm just gonna, I'm leaving. I'm done.
But yeah, so, you know, it can be similar with Rhystic Study because, you know, it's a May, right? You can be like, well, I'll decline. I'll only draw 1 card this turn cycle, or I won't draw off of anything on your turn, right? There's all different ways you can kind of try and negotiate these deals, but, you know, this is an opportunity where those kinds of deals, I think, are plentiful.
So actually, interesting enough, I feel like I'm sort of in the middle of a spectrum-ish here. I know we had a massive discussion pre-show about like deals and how they sort of suck in a lot of ways, but
which I disagree with.
I also like I think my personal. We're not gonna get into this discussion, but the point was, I'm sort of the opinion they're not great for the game, but I still like make deals in the course of play because they're still optimal a lot of the time, and like if you can wring percentage points out of them, then you probably should. But I feel, Morgan, like you're probably the person in this call currently who's like the least likely to initiate like some long protracted like series of deals and commitments. So I'm sort of like interested in your view here of like how often this happens, or like sort of your like your like problem solving decision making for like sort of like cutting your losses on a lot of this stuff.
I think like generally I am less likely to go for deals as opposed to like just trying to sort of point out like, I mean, well, the thing is that you know, the more interaction that's spent, the obviously the riskier it is that you're not getting an untap. So generally I'll try and like leverage you know, doing certain things about the game state. One of the things I've done a couple of times is I've actually just floated, like I've tapped in such a way that I just floated my blue mana and then cast like whatever it was, Rhystic Study. And then so it's like,
right, I've already
I'm locked in now. I'm not holding up interaction
Yeah.
for this person's turn.
Yeah.
If you want to spend your interaction here, like, I mean, I might as well use my interaction because I can't hold it up.
Yeah, that's a very good move. Like you're forcing
like,
someone else's hand. Yeah,
just like as a threat of essentially being like, yeah, either way, I'm not holding up interaction for the other person's turn, so it's your call if you want me to like if you want to spend your interaction too.
Yeah. Which
And
is sort of
just
like
things
the
like that.
I mean, it's a really. I would not advise everyone do that in all instances because it's a you need to be. It's a risk, right?
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
a
yeah,
risk,
for
yeah.
sure.
But
Because
it's a
sometimes
very
certain
powerful
value
tool.
engines you need to calculate. Like you need to not just put yourself trying to like browbeat your opponents into letting you resolve game-winning value engines because what you need to do is you need to. I mean, this is kind of and this could be a good maybe mini topic or something about the idea of like incremental value and value engines that are like not good enough to kind of win the game on the spot, and so people are more likely to let it resolve. And are those better than massive value engines that are must counters and get fought over a lot? There's some debate there in the community. So it needs to be in a position where you think that it's not. You're not forcing your opponent to be like, well, I have to counter this because it's so good. It's going to be so game winning if this resolves. Sort of situation. That's the only caveat I would make there.
Yeah, for sure. This is. I think also I tend to subscribe to, like for actions at least. I would say less is more a lot of the time. Where, like I'll talk a lot and try and like influence people's threat perception or threat assessment. But in terms of like the sort of powerful political plays, like chain bullying people, chain of vaporing somebody else to force them to sack a land to get rid of the real threat, or forcing people to do like actions that they generally wouldn't want to do, or taking big risks like that. I think if you do them all the time, they sort of, even if people aren't consciously deciding that they're not going to work, they are going to work less. Like people are just going to, it's like, all right, well, I don't want you to have a heuristic study, so I guess I'll just take the risk on this person untapping with whatever. And I think it also, like, there is sort of there's like a weird novelty bonus to political plays where, like, when you do something strange that your opponents don't understand, they're like, what's that about? And
Yeah.
like you can often
Yeah.
get away with like some odd stuff, or like sneaking things in or whatever. Sort of an example I had was at the last tournament in Buffalo, which I just realized, I guess this one won't be out before the next one. I was like, we should have announced that we're going to that. But
Yeah.
at the last tournament in Buffalo, I had a Court of Calling, and I could get like Razaketh or Elishnorn, and I was like, there is absolutely, we're locked under Trinisphere and Winter Orb, but I have a Cradle, and I was like, there's absolutely no way that if I just go like, cool, tap this Cradle for 1,000,000 mana and cast Court of Calling for 8, that it's gonna resolve. But I was like, but maybe if I cast it for 2, they'll let me do something. And so I was like, all right, cool, I'll cast it for 2. They're like, 2, huh? What are you getting? There's a rule of law, so I couldn't like Thoracle Tainted Pact them or whatever. They were like, whatever, let's see it. And I was like, cool, put in this Fiend Artisan, untap, activate, get Elishnorn.
Yeah.
But that is a trick that only works a couple of times.
Yeah.
Or the classic like overpay.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna finale for 4. What are you for? Notion Thief? Yeah, sure, great. Alright, Granite Sure.
The overpay for 2 is like it keeps getting like more what you have to overpay in order to like really get
Exactly.
people. Yeah.
Well, it's also you can't go past a certain point, because if you're paying like 6, they're just like, okay, he's just going Seaborn Muse, like this. This isn't smart. It's like, well.
Cool. So next one I think that's kind of worth talking about is triggers. Responding to triggers and missing triggers. Okay, so missed triggers. I think this is one that is comes up a lot, and people, comes up with heuristic studies and remorse all the time because people forget to draw. Your long protracted games, people cast spells, and I cast this. Any responses? No. Okay, cool. It resolves. Ah, crap! I missed my trigger. Happens to all of us. Whatever. But what's important to know is when you've actually missed a trigger, because people think you might. People tend to operate on the assumption that a trigger is missed when it's not. So with Ristic Study and Remora, you do not have to announce the trigger until it is relevant to the game. And Morgan, you're more familiar with the rules, so if I say something stupid, just correct me. But I think that's correct.
That's a lot of power you've given me there.
Basically,
I'm just trying to if I say something wrong, it's Morgan's fault.
Yeah, it's wild because I'm more than happy to sign away my my Scryfall privileges to just the Morgan card database, mental card database, but the Magic rules text might be a bit far for me personally.
But yeah, so something like I cast, I've got a Ristic Study, my opponent casts a spell, and I've got a Ristic Study in play. I go to cast Archmage Emeritus. Someone goes to counter it. I'm like, oh shit, I really want to resolve my Archmage Emeritus. I'm gonna counter back. Most people are like, he missed his Ristic Study trigger. Idiot, he's not gonna draw his card. Well, when, let's say, my counterspell does resolve, counters theirs, next element I can say, do you pay 1 for your spell? Like, I might have actually missed it at the time, it slipped my mind because I would have rather had an additional card to see before I, committed my counterspell, but the trigger is still not missed because it kind of occupies that space beyond it. Like, you could have just been responding to it. You don't have to announce it to say that it's on the stack and then respond on top of that. You can respond, and then when it would naturally come up, you can say, do you pay the 1?
Yeah, so I guess basically just to make sure we're phrasing it as clearly as possible, a trigger's only missed when you reach a game state after it would needed to have resolved without resolving it. So if the spell that triggers Ristic Study resolves without you saying anything about a Ristic Study trigger, you've missed that trigger. But as long as that spell is still in the stack, or even if it's been countered but the stack hasn't fully emptied, and everything that's been done could have been done in response to the trigger, it's assumed that everything was done in response to the trigger.
Unless explicitly stated.
Unless explicitly stated otherwise, yes. Which is why it's important to be clear about exactly what you're doing. You are not obligated to point out your opponent's triggers, but you
can.
Yeah. And you definitely should sometimes.
It's a fun kind of game when you're like, right now, depending on how the rest of the stack goes, I'm unsure whether or not I'm going to remind you of your trigger.
Yeah.
You're like, right now, I don't want you to draw that card, but it might come up later that I do.
I have like a couple of fish triggers in the stack here, and we'll see if
yeah. And yeah, so then in general, this also kind of just applies to putting your spells and timing your spells according to, and potentially sequencing your spells depending on triggers. And Morgan and Reed, I think, both covered this a bit when they were talking about timing and sequencing of not wanting to get a long counterspell battle and draw the Ristic Study player a billion cards, so leading with a more hard counter, or a harder to respond to counter like Flusterstorm. And yeah, so and then also there's the aspect of replying to or responding to your opponent's Ristic Study triggers, so they're not seeing additional cards, so that it can help you kind of win a counter war that way. I think most players are pretty good about that, though.
I mean, going the other way as well, and going back into a bit of political talking as well, but sort of leveraging that for your own gain as well, as if you certainly know that you want somebody to miss a Ristic Study trigger, like you don't want them to remember it. Potentially, if there's like a bit of stack battle or whatever, and there might be some implied triggers still left in the stack, but you still want to respond, you can be like, oh, okay, so the stack is X, X, and X, right? Not including the Ristic Study trigger. So it's like, oh, so the stack is the ad nause and then the dispel, right? That's the stack. And if they confirm, you're like, oh, okay, great, then I'll respond with X thing. And now we're at a point where like you can't have the triggers in the stack anymore.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I should amend. I said if you reach a point where the trigger would needed to have been acknowledged, or if you can get someone to acknowledge the game state without the trigger,
yes,
which is what Reed is describing there.
Yeah.
Peak scumbaggery, if I know.
Hey, I'm just saying, you get your percentage points where you can get them.
Yeah.
I would say one other thing to be like really careful of, and this isn't so much around like missing triggers, but I think something that Reed can attest can lead to very hairy judge calls, but also just will lead to a lot of judge calls, is when there's multiple effects like Rhystic Studies and Mystic Remoras, and a bunch of people are drawing cards as people continue to take actions. You really do have to be very careful about making sure priorities being passed appropriately, because like, especially when people start, when there's like spells that are like a 2-2 split on them resolving as opposed to a 3-1, it's often correct to like let the first Rhystic Study trigger resolve and then respond to the second one. And often I'll see the person whose trigger will resolve second asking, can I draw? And like, that just kind of shortcuts through the first person's trigger. So just, that's a situation that I think you should be careful in. I mean, there are opportunities to put into practice the things we've been describing earlier, but there are also just opportunities to get a lot of GRVs. So
yeah, it's definitely like, I think typically the stuff that we're talking about in terms of, especially like contextualizing the mistrigger stuff specifically, typically tends to happen on smaller scale stack wars with like a single Rhystic Study or like a single triggering thing effective play. Typically, once you get past a certain point in terms of complexity and like a lot of stuff happening, it really just becomes worth it every time to, like, whenever a spell is cast or like a game action is taken, you just like straight up just like rebuild the stack from top to bottom or bottom to top and like re-okay it with everybody before going forward. Because a lot of the time, yeah, you can get into like really messy, like, oh, I thought they passed priority, so I did this, but I guess like one person hadn't passed priority on the thing yet, so this shouldn't have happened, except like,
and it's like so hard to unwind.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I'm not sure if I've told the story on the podcast, but I will, because I think it's still a funny one of like getting into an issue like that, except like even worse in a lot of ways, of just like multiple things had been implied to have happened except for one person who hadn't explicitly passed priority on like a Rhystic Study trigger and like 2 spells resolving, which had like had the actions for said spells taken, which included drawing cards and doing other stuff before that person could like say wait, no. Anyway, got to a point where after a very lengthy judge call plus escalation to the head judge, we got to a point where the head judge was just like, okay, this stack that is currently like after like rearranging, like clarifying some stuff, was like, okay, this current stack is a legal stack, right? Yes. Okay, resolve it. You're just playing on from here. I know, we're not doing any rolling back. We're not doing any reordering. This is a legal stack. Resolve it. Keep playing.
Damn.
So, point being, you don't want to get into that situation. Be very explicit about stacks when they get too complex.
Cool. So we've got only a couple more points left here. I think this one kind of ties into some of the things that we were touching on earlier, which is leveraging known information. So I'll just kind of speak on this briefly, which is, we were talking about when you're after turn player, passing priority to make sure that the last player in priority has to use their kind of interaction first if they have it, because we were talking about that in the context of just not knowing if they have it, but if it's a Thrasios player, they're gonna have to reset priority anyway, blah blah blah. But knowing, throughout the game, people drop hints about what kind of interaction they have through their pauses. They're like, let me think about whether or not I want to interact here, or they're gonna pause on certain spells, not on other ones. You can start to deduce what they have in hand. Also how they're what they're playing out in terms of value engines, how many cards they have in hand. You kind of estimate how many counter spells or pieces of interaction they might have. Lots of ways to get like little tidbits of information or good kind of ideas just of what to kind of operate under, like certain assumptions to operate under. But using that to your advantage is, I think, a really key piece in getting better at navigating the stack. And that's just going to be forcing people to use not accumulate an absurd amount of interaction into their hand, and like while you and everyone else depletes it. Because it tends to be like, just if you're playing control and you kind of start to look the game this way, the player who has the most pieces of interaction gets to dictate the pace of the game a lot of the time, right? They get to decide whether or not a spell is going to resolve. They get to kind of, it's not bully or browbeat, but like they get to influence people about whether or not they're even going to attempt to do something. Someone's like, if you go to cast your commander, I am going to fight over it. If you go to cast his Ristic Study or Naws, I am going to fight over it. You're going to lose. I can turn my hand towards you. I can show you 5 different counter spells, and I know you can't, interact here, so just don't do it. Like, the player who has all that interaction has the most tools at their disposal. So trying to maintain that balance by forcing other players to use their interaction is a super important aspect of the game. Anything to add to that?
No, you got most
cool.
of it.
So then the other point we had here was forcing opponent actions, which is kind of very similar. Which leaves,
yeah, but also like intersects with like forcing opponent actions also like intersects with table positioning and like ordering of where people are in priority and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So you can like it. A lot of it is just in the abstract, just like setting up situations where you can incentivize your opponents to act before you do, in like ways that are beneficial to you.
Yeah, and the last point we have here is instant-itis, which I think typically isn't brought up in this sort of context of like stack interaction. It tends to be more for kind of proactive spells, like something like a Vampiric Tutor.
Yeah, but
using it
for you to bring it up.
Yeah, using it. I didn't even add this point, but I'll talk about it gladly. Yeah, so like the typical instant-itis is casting a Vamp Tutor in the end step before your turn, giving your opponents, someone plays fetch pass. Okay, end step before my turn, tap Vampiric Tutor. They're like, okay, crack fetch, go get Bayou, Dark Ritual, Op Agent. And you've screwed yourself for no reason because you would have had the opportunity to just Vamp Tutor on your turn. And, it depends on if what you're going to Vamp Tutor for changes depending on what you're going to see from your opponents. But if it's just going to be like a crypt either way, there's no real advantage to getting your opponents to see extra cards. Maybe they draw a misstep, letting them hold up interaction for like op agents and stuff. So that's the kind of core idea of instant-itis. But in the context of stack battles and things, what I would say is it can be about like timing your removal would be a good example.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I think removal is really where this mostly applies, is like not just like a lot of the time it is going to be correct to wait until the end step right before you untap to like fire off removal at something, but like you have to be aware of a lot of the time when it's not like you're not waiting until the last possible moment to use removal, and this even applies in between, like on the spectrum between main phase on your turn empty stack using removal and using it in the end step directly before you untap. A lot of time you'll see stuff like this where people will just like either remove a Ristic Study immediately, or just like wait forever until it's like, okay, this is becoming way too much of an issue, I'm gonna remove it. A lot of the time what you can actually do is like have a Ristic Study just like be in play, and sort of use it, especially if you know that people are going to be like relatively conservative around it or responsible around a Ristic Study or a fish or just like something in general like that, or an Archivist of Ogma, that you can sort of like wait on removal just a bit to sort of make those people play more conservatively around that piece, and then right before you like know or think that some stack battle is going to happen, or like people need to crack a bunch of fetches to get their mana rolling or do whatever, then right at that moment you point a removal spell at the Ristic Study or the Archivist or etc.
Yeah, I think just a really good example is if you're player A, player B has a turn, player C is the one with the heuristic study, is instead of just firing off, killing the heuristic study in your turn, just waiting until player B's end step.
Yeah.
Right, like that's the last, it stops player B, gives them the opportunity to use any removal spells they might have had on it, if that's something they were going to do, but then you're not letting player C, the player with the heuristic study, untap, have access to more mana and cards to potentially defend it, right?
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Another good one is to remove removing the heuristic study, like, or similar thing, right before you know, like, a big stack war is going to happen.
Yeah.
Like, if someone controls a heuristic study and casts an ad nause, telling everyone else, hey, hold off before we start fighting over this ad nause, like, let me kill this heuristic study.
Yeah.
And then we can fight, so they're not just getting gassed up the whole time. Is often a good one.
Cool. Any last minute points anyone wants to make about tips and tricks for navigating the stack before we move on?
Yeah, it's just I think honestly a lot of this stuff is I mean it's knowing about this, like having the prerequisite knowledge for a lot of the stuff, and just like how stacks function and like the specificities of like all the different ways that priority works and the incentives and what you can, like, what usually ends up happening in a lot of situations. But once you have that, a lot of the actual execution on this stuff is just not getting complacent and not like autopiloting through a lot of stack stuff, and just like every time there's some weird thing happening with spells in response to spells, or triggers happening and then spells on top of those or whatever, just reevaluate the game state as is, without like doing any as much mental shortcutting as possible, and just actually think through what is going to happen and what needs to happen from your end in order to navigate it like correctly.
Yeah, and if you think through this stuff enough, it does become second nature, and you can more or less autopilot through some things because you've built in these good habits. But even then, you should never be fully relying on those habits. Like the good habit that you should have is to critically think about the situations that you need to spend. Yeah, the more time you spend thinking about this stuff, like in building in the habits, it just means that you get more time. It monopolizes less of your thinking time. Exactly. Ideally, you should be thinking every possible second you can, but you don't want to have to. You know, once you've thought about something enough times, you can kind of shortcut some of that. Yeah, you
don't want to spend all of your processing power. Like you want to basically practice it to get it to a point where doing that full evaluation, or like reasonably full evaluation of the game state, just takes less time, and you can just like shortcut that evaluation. But you don't want to be shortcutting past that evaluation.
For sure.
You always want to be doing like a base level. Okay, set ground rules. What do I need to do here? Cool, got that. Great, let's go. But you don't want to be skipping past that step almost ever.
Cool. Morgan, any final words, or forever hold your peace?
No, I think we've pretty thoroughly covered this topic.
Cool. Well, that means that we can move on to everyone's favorite segment. You're going to have to definitely mess with the levels on that.
I mean, it's the return. It's been
Gut check.
Just dial up the compressor a little bit.
Gut
check.
Woo. Okay, so Gut check today is brought to you by, I've been thinking a lot about ChatGPT lately.
We also had like 6 months to
yes.
gut checks.
So my gut check is, how long do you think, and just like literally from the get, time-wise, is it going to take until ChatGPT can make a CEDH deck for a newly spoiled commander that's at least 80% as good as what an experienced brewer could make?
Okay, what is as good? Give us
it's subjective. I said 80% as good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm saying like as good. What is 80% as good?
Yeah, it's using objective metrics, but it's subjective, right? Like, I don't know.
All right, sure. Yeah.
Like, I was gonna say, probably something. It's not just like 80 cards of what the 80 card overlap, and then 20 cards of like random like junk, right? Like,
do you mean like a fully legal deck for said commander? Like,
no. Yeah, like better than that. Like, it's like a good deck.
Yeah. 5 years of.
Yeah, commander. Okay, one more qualifier. Does it, like, are we just giving it the name of the commander, or are we giving it, like, here's the commander, give me a deck for it? Like, here's
you put in the characteristics.
You give it the card text?
Okay.
Yeah. In that case, probably, like, 3 years, like 2 to 3 years, if they actually do start training GPT-5 at any point.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I was thinking, like,
if they're not training GPT-5, then, like, however long it takes for somebody to catch up.
Yeah, they're not training GPT-5 currently, is my understanding. But they are still doing things to improve GPT-4, and obviously there's, like, plugins and extensions, and people are working on, like, different API, whatever. It's like people are doing a lot of work on it, and the field is obviously expanding. So it might not even be ChatGPT. Maybe I should have amended it to just some AI. But
this is like. Yeah, it's like not impressive to me. I don't know.
Yeah, it's.
I think it was Neil Gaiman who put it perfectly, which is ChatGPT doesn't give you information; it gives you information-shaped sentences.
Yeah,
and I feel like people are buying into like a bunch of the stuff that I've read has just been like, well, first of it, a bunch of it has just been wrong. But like a bunch of it has actually just been incoherent. Like it doesn't even. It's not even just like, oh, it made like a minor mistake. It's like it just doesn't have any clue what the question is. It's just like mashing keywords related to the question into.
Oh, it's more advanced than that, though. Like I think it's
on some things. I'm not saying all the time.
Well, I mean, it will just make up. It makes shit up like at a. But like the other thing is crazy is that it doesn't like. So it obviously makes things up, but it's the things where it does hit. It hits really. Stupendously. Apparently, like a lot of it is like in diagnostics. I saw this one Twitter thread about this this guy's dog had like some kind of anemia, and they took it to a vet, and the vet got the wrong diagnosis or whatever, and they were doing blood work on it, and he just like typed in the blood work into his into ChatGPT and like described the symptoms, and it gave a differential diagnosis that he took to another vet, and they were like, yeah, this seems right, and ended up curing the dog. So I think like that is a bit more than just like
no, but that's like that's a data set search like very cleanly, right? Like that's what computers are excellent.
No, but it's not just a data set search because it's obviously the system is built on, you know, it's a language model, right? It's also taking into natural language processing of what they're saying and describing the symptoms and things like that, and kind of factoring that in, not just like the pure blood work, right?
Sure, but like again, these are
no, I know it's not like crazy
like
out there yet. But the thing is
that are listed.
What I think is impressive is that not that we're there yet, but that we're very clearly way closer to that than we were.
We're not. It's just that this is publicly available. Like this technology has existed.
No, sure. But yeah, I think the fact that it is publicly available is, and that there's now a massive rush for the finish line in order to be like to win the AI race and you know, be the company that has like the leading product on that. I think it's just going to accelerate things even further. So yeah, very exciting. So I follow in roughly with Reed at I think like 3-ish years. Which is wild. Okay.
Cool.
That about wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email, intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/northpodcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.